The following story is a fictional story written by me. By the way, I'm still looking for some stories I can narrate for my next episodes. I'm on the lookout for some specific topics, like Alone at Night, Full Moon, Sightings of the Dogman, or Rest Stops. If you've got any experiences or stories matching those, send them over at darkstories.org. For now, be sure to hit that like button and comment below what you think of this story. Now, let's begin. Someone in my family isn't human, by Darkness Prevails. Someone in my family is not human, and they haven't been since our trip to the family cabin. The four of us had always stayed at the cabin every year in the fall. We spent the initial cooling of autumn by the warmth of a cabin fire, as if to prepare ourselves for an even harsher winter. My father, mother, little brother Chris, and I enjoyed this tradition, and that moment every year when we would first see a leaf change color and fall to the ground, our excitement grew. Our yearly retreat meant sledding, snowball fights, hot chocolate, and that nostalgic scent of pine wood that made up the walls of the structure. We would spend a week there in those snowy mountains, close, bonding, happy. Dad would tell ghost stories and cliched urban legends every evening, and Mom would cook a feast of a country breakfast in the mornings. It was a pine-scented, bacon-flavored heaven. Until that particular nightfall fell, and a horrid noise erupted from the mountains around us. You could call it a howl, but it was unlike any howl I'd ever heard. Nature documentaries, horror films, real life. There was no equivalent to this sound. It seemed to reverberate forever off the slopes. It was loud enough to have our family in fear of an avalanche. But it wasn't a tempest sheet of ice and snow that shook us to our core. There was no avalanche. Rather, the sound of this howl seemed to affect my younger brother. After some time, I noticed he hadn't blinked for several minutes. His eyes watered, tears dripping down his cheeks, and yet he denied his body the satisfaction of blinking. I tried to get his attention, but the moment I spoke his name, he burst from his position on the rug, running out the door. My mother called after him. My father pursued, and in a panic, I found myself on my father's heels. Yet the old man was too fast for me. Moments after we entered the tree line running after my little brother, I'd lost sight of them both. The mess of footprints, animal prints, and various other disturbances in the snow left me with no idea where either of them had gone. My head shot back and forth in every direction, desperate for a clue. Knowing I couldn't just sit there, I ran forward, hoping that one of these sets of tracks would lead me to a familiar face. My cheeks and eyelids burned from the cold and wind that brushed past them. The snow came down harder, causing my teary-eyed vision to become even more dodgy. And then it happened. I hadn't expected to break through a tree line. I hadn't expected to fall down a sharp slope. After that, hitting my head upon a low-hanging branch and blacking out was no surprise at all. When I came to, it was still dark, still night. I looked around and quickly spotted the tree I had assaulted with my head. But now it was a couple of dozen yards away. Looking around me, I found myself further up the slope than when I'd blacked out, with a trail leading from the tree to where I lay now. As if I'd been dragged. Assuming it was my father who, for one odd reason or another, could not accomplish the task of carrying me back to the cabin, I called out his name. I didn't care for any avalanches. I belted my voice across those mountains and prayed my father would find me. There was a response, but it wasn't my father. There was a chilling scream coming from further up. It sounded like my mother. I picked myself up out of the much thicker snow. I lurched up the slope. I managed to find my way back, having memorized the direction of the scream. Sure enough, it had come from our cabin. Emerging from the tree line, I saw the cabin door wide open. It must have been that way for some time, as a thick layer of snow had found purchase on the hardwood floor inside. I took off in a haphazard sprint, meandering my way to the door through the snow. When I set foot on the wood surface, it felt as if I was on another planet. Stable footing was something I didn't know I could miss. "Mom?" I called out as I walked through the doorway. I pushed as much of the snow back outside as I could, and then I shut the door. I glanced around the room. The ember within the fireplace was dwindling, and my mother was nowhere to be seen. She had been sitting at the chair across the room from the fireplace, enjoying a toasty mug of dark roast coffee. With a sniff, I could very well still smell her distinct coffee, even in spite of my runny and stuffy nose. My boots slid, nearly causing me to fall, as I ran to the kitchen. Before I passed through the archway, a figure taller than myself emerged from around the corner. "Mom?" I whimpered. The fire crackled, and thin, dancing strips of light bounced from the form's face. It looked like my mother, but she was frowning and seemed to be staring past me. "Gloria, Chris is hurt." That voice was my father's. I turned on my heel to see him doggedly carrying my little brother in his arms. The small boy's face was tinged red and his breathing shallow. Struggling with what to say or do, I heard my mother finally speak. "Everyone in the car," she demanded. I obeyed without question or hesitation. The four of us piled into that 1999 Range Rover and hauled tail to the nearest hospital or doctor that could see us. To this day, Chris has a small scar on his cheek where he'd gotten frostbite. He doesn't seem to remember a bit of that night, doesn't even recall the mint chocolate cocoa we'd shared by the fire before he sprinted off into that near blizzard. Dad said he'd searched for Chris for several hours. He'd found my brother under the snow, and what bothers me was the way Dad said it appeared Chris had been buried, not simply covered by falling snow. Even now, my dad is adamant that there were dozens of other prints around the mound in which Chris had been buried. As for me, when I woke up from blacking out after hitting that tree branch, I had apparently awakened near morning, though it was still quite dark out. The doctor said I was quite lucky that I didn't get frostbite too, though I did get a nasty concussion. But that didn't weigh on my mind. Instead, I couldn't keep myself from wondering what had dragged me up the slope. Because Dad said he never saw me. He even apologized, saying that he didn't know I took off after him once Chris left the cabin. And regarding my mother, she always behaved strangely when talking about the event. She says when the three of us ran out of the cabin, she closed the door and had an emergency number dialed on her phone ready to call for help at a moment's notice as she watched out the window. But that just doesn't match up. And the way she looked at me when I came back to the cabin. Well, as the months went on after returning home, things slowly felt normal again. We all seemed to forget the panic of that night, realigning ourselves with our daily routines and habits. Before long, I stopped noticing Chris's scar. I stopped pestering my mother about her recollection of events. I stopped harassing my father about exactly what he saw out there. It's funny how going back to school, spending the night at friends' houses, and enjoying the newest video games can make it seem as if a traumatic event never happened. Or maybe I simply didn't want to think about it anymore. A few months after the cabin excursion, I awoke one night to my eyes watering and my nose wrinkled. There hung a sour smell in the air, working thoughts of spoiled milk or sun-worn cheese in my mind. It was the first time in my life a smell had been vile enough to stir me from slumber. I gagged when I tried to yawn. Throwing the sheets off of me, I groggily crept from my bed in search of the smell. One messy plop underfoot later, I realized the source of the smell lay right at the foot of my bed, right where I had just stepped. Lifting my foot and wincing at the wretched sensation of unknown sludge and mucus stuck to my heel, I stared down at the rug. A pile the color of pitch dark blue, with tinges of peachy flesh-tinted clots, sat as a splatter on the floor. There was so much of it. Horrified, I screamed, awaking my brother who shared the room with me and causing my father to come running down the hallway. "What's the matter?" he asked hurriedly after throwing open the door. I don't know what this stuff is, and it's everywhere." I tried to maintain composure in my explanation. My dad approached where I was standing. He squinted his eyes and flinched when the smell really hit him. What did you do?" he demanded to know, still staring at the refuse while pinching his nose. I didn't do anything. How could I even make something?" I pointed at the revolting mess. "Like this." My father raised an eyebrow, looking to me then back at the sludge-like mass. He walked over and knelt down, examining the substance. I thought he was going to touch it for a second, but then I saw him grimace. A few extended moments later, he said, Just clean it up, the both of you." I rolled my eyes, still ready to vomit or scream, depending on what the sludge decided to do if I touched it. Chris went straight for the bottle of Febreze we kept in the bathroom. A minute after Dad had left the room, he came back. "Hey, did your mother pass by here?" I shook my head. His brow furrowed. I listened to him walk down the hallway toward the living room, calling her name, but not getting a response. After cleaning up the mess, Chris and I helped look for her, but she was nowhere in or around the house. She wasn't answering her phone either. After hours of searching, we all slept in Dad's bed, hoping she would return soon. In the morning, I woke up next to Dad, who seemed to be unblinkingly staring at the opposite end of the bed. Slowly, I looked over past Chris's still sleeping form, and there was my mother, smiling at us as if she had just awakened from a peaceful night's rest. "Good morning," she bid us. My father woke Chris and forced the two of us out of their room. We then heard our parents arguing for the next 10 minutes, after which my mother stormed out of their room and sat patiently at the kitchen table while her coffee brewed from our Keurig. The smell of dark roast coffee hung in the air. I cringed at it, reminded of the cabin. That was all it took before I looked at her like I looked at her then, with suspicion and fear. Once the sound of coffee spurting from the dispenser ceased, Mom walked over, then returned with her steaming beverage. She stared off into the distance, which wasn't more than a tall kitchen window with white blinds. That was the face of my mother, deeply concerned. It was then I happened to find focus on her fingernails. There was something there to see, and my eyes wouldn't pry away from them, even though I didn't understand why for a few seconds. Then, mouth agape, I knew. The same pitch-dark blue substance, it was stuck underneath each one of her fingernails. There were even traces of the flesh-colored clots. Feeling a need to ascertain what I'd noticed, I ran up to her and forced my arms around her. A hug that I wanted to recoil from, but I was close enough then to smell her hand. Coffee grounds, earth, curdled milk, and putrid cheese. "Oh, sweetie, Mom and Dad are gonna be okay." She rubbed my forearm, those dirty nails sliding across my skin. "It's just, I'm going through a hard time right now, okay?" I released my hold on her and stepped back. She was crying. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at me. No, through me, once again. I hated it. Something about the way she now looked at me I despised. It made me nauseous and angry all at once. My mother, ever since that night at the cabin, hadn't once looked at me normally. Hadn't once treated me as she had used to. That was the beginning of the changing of my mind. This person drinking my mother's coffee, wearing my mother's bathrobe, and sitting at my mother's chair, it wasn't my mother at all. From then on, I kept a safe distance from her, but I always made sure I was close enough to observe her. Sometimes I would watch her when she didn't know I was there. I was invigorated to rediscover her daily routine. Was it the same? If she looked at her own son so differently anymore, then surely the small, more mundane aspects of her life had changed in kind. I watched her do the laundry through cracked door. I stared at her when she left for her morning runs. I pretended not to notice when she came back, glancing a little bit more than she knew. Yet it all seemed the same. Aside from the occasional discrepancies in her behavior, like the night with the mess in my room, my mother acted like she used to. Then I decided to test her in a different way. When she'd leave on her own, I'd ask to go with her. When she'd go for runs, I'd ask to join her. When she was bored and looking at her phone, I requested that she play a board game with me. Any decent parent would see this as a child longing for more attention from their parent. But it soon became clear to me that my mother didn't see it this way. She seemed hesitant when I asked to tag along, and when she would eventually give in, Mom would always have nothing to say or talk about. It was clear she didn't want me around her. This broke my heart even more. My mother and I had always been so close. She used to read the Boxcar Children book series to me in bed. She always made sure I got dibs on the mixing bowl when she was making brownies or cookies. And when my first girlfriend broke up with me, my mother held me and cried with me. That had been my mother. Whoever or whatever this person was, it was no longer her. One night, I awoke in a cold sweat. Something felt wrong. I felt hot and cold, achy yet numb, and I had a bad taste in my mouth. I sat up in my bed and wiped my tired eyes. When I opened them again, I nearly screamed. A tall, dark figure stood at the edge of my bed. Feminine, familiar, my mother. She was holding something in her right hand, but it was too dark for me to be sure of what it was. "Mom?" I called to her in an exhausted voice. She did not voice a reply. Instead, she shook her head. Seconds later, I could see a glimmer in her eyes. Tears? She stepped forward, beginning to approach my side of the bed, her right hand rising into the air with that unknown object grasped tightly. I tried to crawl away, but my back hit only wall. Then she began to swing. Instinctively, I closed my eyes and covered my face with my hands, palm out. In that moment, I can't be sure if I felt anything at all, but I do know my heart pounded with denial. "Honey, what are you?" My father entered the room and turned on the light. Revealed was my mother, standing over me, a knife in her hand. There was blood on my blankets, blood on my hands, and that repugnant odor had once again returned. I looked her right in the eyes. There seemed to be nothing human left in them. My father leapt and stole the knife from her grasp, shouting expletives. When the knife fell, hitting the hardwood floor with a metallic clang, she took off from my room. I heard her exit the house. My dad began to dial 911, but I grabbed him by the arm. "Please don't. Not Mama," I pleaded. He looked at me. Then he turned toward my brother, who was cowering wide awake in the corner. My father, gritting his teeth, locked his phone. He took the two of us to his room and began to explain that our mother just wasn't well. She needed help, he said, but even he didn't seem to understand what was wrong with her or why. My heart ached. I was breathless the remainder of the night. How could she have done this? Even if my paranoid thoughts about her were now solidified, I still could not believe it. My own mother had tried to kill me. Dad called my grandma on Mom's side, letting her know which direction she took off in and that it might be best to find her sooner rather than later. I didn't sleep that night, opting to wander the halls, looking out the windows of our quiet home and afraid I'd see my own mother through them. I went to the front door, making sure it was locked. Then I checked the back. While the back door was closed, I noticed it was unlocked. As I reached for the bolt, I paused. There was a dark red stain on the floor leading underneath the door. Swallowing hard, I opened the back door and I peered outside. Thankfully, my mother wasn't there. But something else was, something that smelled of rot and soil. Looking down, my eyes saw it lying on the mat, an amputated, dirt-covered human leg. I wanted to vomit. I cried into my hands that my father had quickly bandaged. Though I didn't know who my mother was anymore, I took the leg and I hid it in a hole in the backyard. I still loved my mother, and I didn't want to see her in trouble. I went back to bed, and I tried to forget the entire night. For weeks, we didn't hear from my mom, until Dad finally got a call from Grandma stating that she was okay and being looked closely after at their place. My dad was quick to caution them. reminding them that having attacked her own son, there was no telling what she might do. Soon after, my mom began calling us herself. At first, Dad wouldn't even pick up the phone, but missing her, it didn't take long for him to relent. She begged him to come over to her parents' house so they could talk this through. He refused a dozen times before finally agreeing to see her. I couldn't blame the man. He loved my mom and had always been crazy about her. When the day came that he would talk with her, he pulled me aside and asked me to watch Chris here at the house. I complied with a nod, but what he didn't know was that I'd already told Chris that I'd be going with him. When he wasn't looking, I hid myself in the back of the vehicle just as he was about to leave. Half an hour later, the incessant bumps in the road I felt told me we were pulling into a gravel driveway. We were at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Dad exited the car and closed the door. I heard him speaking with my grandparents outside before they let him in. When I was sure no one remained outside, I crept from the back of the vehicle and made my way to the side of the house. I'd spent the night here many times before. I knew they had only 2 bedrooms, one a master bedroom and the other a guest room. If my mother needed a place of privacy to talk with my dad, it would certainly be in the guest room she'd be staying in. Staying close to the wall, I rounded the house. I crouched below the guest bedroom window, and I placed my ear to the wall. The house was old. That was to my advantage. I could hear nearly perfectly through the wooden planks.
"I didn't attack our son."
My mother sounded exasperated.
"I saw you in the kid's room holding a knife."
My dad shouted back.
"Did you see him?"
"My son, bloodied from his own mother trying to cut him up? Of course I did."
"Henry, I didn't touch him with that knife. That blood wasn't his. Did you not check him for cuts?"
"Gloria, there was so much blood. I bandaged him up as quickly as I could and prayed he wouldn't need a doctor. A doctor would need answers, and the kids begged me not to call the authorities on you. I couldn't risk it."
"No, Henry, there were no cuts on him. Have you not seen how strangely he's been acting?"
"What? Are you trying to blame him for this?"
"He's always watching, always listening. He's been following me everywhere I go, and then I saw that leg at the back door and—"
"Leg? What?"
"That night, I found a severed human leg at the back door. Didn't you hear the news the next day? About the missing kid in our neighborhood?"
"No,
Henry, our son did that."
I listened unblinkingly, staring down at my bandaged hands. I began to unwrap them. Layer by layer, I could see my skin. Dried blood. No cuts. No bruises, no slices, nothing. The blood wasn't mine. My hands were perfectly clean, unscarred. My mother continued.
"Look, I don't want to say it outright. Not yet. So I'll just start where it began. You remember what happened at the cabin, don't you? The weird howl in the mountains, little Chris running out the door in the snow. Well, Ben chased after you. Ben kept asking my account of what happened that night, but I always told him a lie. I didn't want him to know what I knew. You see, I chased after Ben. I was afraid one of you would get lost out there, and I had to make sure you would all be okay. I followed Ben, but he managed to stumble down a slope. When I saw him hit that tree, I was horrified, and I started to rush towards him, but then I saw something. I don't know what it was, but it crawled through the snow on all fours, and its limbs were so thin. It couldn't have been human. It grabbed Ben while he was unconscious and began to drag him up the mountain. I shouted at the thing. I couldn't let it take my son. But it turned its eyes on me and began to bound through the snow towards me. I ran back to the cabin. I figured there'd be something there I could defend myself with. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find and hid around the corner. The next thing I knew, the door slammed open. I didn't hear anything after that, save for another howl. Hours must have passed before I heard that door shut. I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen, and I rounded the corner. I saw Ben in front of me. I hid the knife behind me. I didn't want to scare him. I wanted to grab him and thank the heavens he was okay, but I stood there, frozen. Henry, Ben's eyes, they were solid black, and he was covered in this thick, dark substance. I couldn't bear to look right at him, but I looked long enough to see the black fade from his eyes and the substance absorb into his skin.
Gloria, this is too much for me. You're lying. What happened to you?
Nothing, Henry, but something happened to Ben. I left him out there. I didn't go back for him. That thing got him. That boy we brought home. That boy isn't ours. Think about it, Henry. He didn't have any damage from the cold like Chris did. The doctor said he had a concussion, but there was no sign of one at home. And that night when you three found that sludge in his room, I wasn't there that night because I'd been trying to dispose of the other half of it.
What?
Ben isn't human. That stuff, it comes from him. He changes. He follows a certain smell. I've seen the way he looks at us, the way he smells people and stares at them. When I watched him change again, I stayed up waiting for him to come home. Well, last time he came home with that human leg in his mouth. That's why I had a knife, Henry. Please, you have to believe me.
I hadn't realized that I'd slumped over onto the ground. I was still staring at my hands. She had to be lying, right? I thought to myself. I'm still me. I'm the same me that I remember. I tried to reason with everything she had confessed, but everything was perfectly explained by what she said. The muck under her nails, the sludge at the foot of my bed, the way she suddenly started looking at me and treating me differently. And most of all, the blood on my hands that didn't come from me. My mother and father have since separated. My dad kept both of us, and my mother now lives with her parents. She calls almost every day, begging my dad to keep Chris safe from me. I can hear her over the phone with how loud she begs, but my father doesn't completely believe her. Or he does, and he's simply in denial. I've seen how he looks at me when he tells Chris and me goodnight. I've seen how he lingers at the door, staring right at me for a moment before leaving the door open and going to his own room down the hallway. I've seen how he cleans up my messes in the middle of the night by the bed, pretending it's normal, like it's the mess of some puppy that needs to be housebroken. And now every night, when I close my eyes to sleep, I look at my brother. He's still so young enough to sleep peacefully. At most, he's confused about everything that's happened, but he trusts us all as he always had. But I don't trust myself, because one day I'm afraid that the other me I change into will see how easy of a meal Chris might be.